Face the Issues with Bill Sharp is a news and public affairs presentation of WCSC TV. Our topic for this evening's program, handgun registration. Our guest tonight, the Honorable Darvin Purdy, Mayor of Kennesaw, Georgia, and Chief Reuben Greenberg of the Charleston City Police Department. And now your host, Bill Sharp.
Welcome to our program. Our panel of reporters are Harv Jacobs with WCSC Radio, the news director, and Bruce Smith, the Associated Press, the AP. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Mayor Purdy, if you would start by telling us about this law that you have in Kennesaw, Georgia, whereby every household is required to have some kind of a gun.
We passed a law in March of 1982 requiring each head of household residing within their city limits to maintain a firearm, not necessarily a handgun, a firearm together with suitable ammunition. We had certain exemptions built into the law. If you're conscientiously opposed because of religious doctrine or belief or convicted felons, of course you're exempt from the law.
And you have said that that has cut down on break-ins in your town.
One of the reasons we passed the law was the deterrent effect we anticipated it would have on prospective criminal conduct, and fortunately that has proven to be true.
Chief Greenberg, how do you feel about something like this, a law requiring each citizen or every household to be armed?
Well, I look upon a statute of that kind the same way I would look upon a statute that would require people to give up their guns, not to have a gun. I don't think that either statute could be enforced. I don't think there's any enforcement mechanism in Kennesaw to require someone to actually have a firearm of whatever type in his household. And if the police found that the person did not have such a firearm, that they would charge him, that somebody would prosecute him, or that he would be convicted. Similarly, I think that things having to do with trying to confiscate handguns would meet perhaps even more failure, in the sense that I simply don't believe in this country that we're at the point that we can confiscate handguns from people. I think we're beyond that. I think we have to take other kinds of means in order to maintain some sort of sanity in regards to handgun ownership.
Do you advocate the ownership of a handgun or any kind of a gun in a household?
In my own experience, I have found that the disadvantages of having a handgun in the home, and I want to stress in the home as opposed to in the business, far outweigh the advantages.
Why?
As a police officer, I go to numerous, in the various places I've worked, numerous homicide scenes. And people will tell you that they have a handgun to discourage burglars. I'm sure that most of the people here in Charleston that were shot last year, who shot someone, said that they had their handguns for the purpose of shooting burglars. And I want to tell you that no burglar was shot in Charleston last year, though 12 other people lost their lives. In various places I've worked, no burglar has been shot by a homeowner or a businessman. The person more likely to be shot with that weapon is one's son, one's daughter, the guy next door, Uncle Harry, or somebody like this. So regardless of what people say the purpose of the weapon is, we have to look at what in fact the weapon is used for. And it tends to be used against a loved one or some person who's a family member in a dispute and not in a crime.
Barring handguns, would you advocate the arming of a household with a rifle or a shotgun?
I don't advocate the arming of households with either rifles or handguns. I think that's an individual decision that ought to be left up to the individual homeowner if he wants to have a handgun or if he wants to have a firearm of any kind.
All right, let's go to Harv Jacobs.
Thank you, Bill. Mr. Mayor, how can you prove or justify that what works for your small town will work in a city the size of Charleston, or as you said in a newspaper article, New York? Let's face it, Charleston, New York are much bigger than Kennesaw. In your town, most of the people probably know each other, and the chances of a violent crime occurring there are slim, while in a big city where you have such a large cross-section of people who don't know each other, chances are greater for violent crime. I'd like you to back up that statement where you said your law will work in New York City.
Okay, the population of the municipality, in our view, has nothing whatsoever to do with the beneficial effects and the deterrent effect of gun ownership. The households statistics will show, well, in our area and otherwise, where the opposite is true, where the guns are taken away from the households, crime increases rather dramatically. It's our belief and contention that an armed citizen is a safer citizen, and that the chief indicated there were no burglars shot in this area last year. There are many benefits of a gun in the household other than actual shooting a perpetrator. The deterrent effect, of course, is a primary advantage.
But we don't have anything like this in any big city right now. I don't see how you can say it'll work in New York, a city with 8 million people, when it hasn't been implemented yet in a big city.
Well, again, sheer numbers will not affect the deterrent effect of an armed citizen, whether it's 1 million people or whether it's 500. If the criminal element recognizes that those citizens are capable of defending themselves and not being intimidated, it's our belief that the effect will be the same.
All right, let's go to Bruce Smith.
Mayor, what is the compliance level with your law in the town? How many people obey it? And if somebody is found to be violating the law, what happens to them?
Well, as I indicated earlier, we do have exemptions within our law. At the time it was implemented, we did not intend to have any house-to-house searches, nor have we had any, nor will we have any. We expect our compliance rate is approximately 95%. Our citizens were reasonably heavy armed before the law was passed, and now again it's our educated guess that it's 95% compliance.
Don't you think that there are other methods that could deter crime? For instance, burglars, say a burglar alarm or something that might be less likely to have adverse effects than having a gun in the house?
Oh, you're absolutely correct. Crime and its causation is a multifaceted problem, very, very complex. The deterrent effect of an armed citizen is one of the many aspects of reducing crime.
But you think that is the most effective way to deter crime? An armed citizen as opposed to, say, a burglar alarm or some other method that...
Well, I wouldn't necessarily go so far as to say that. I say it's the most effective means of self-defense, meaning more effective than your hairpins, your car keys, your mace, etc. But the firearm in conjunction with other preventive measures enhances the likelihood of you not becoming a victim.
How often has your law been used? How many burglars have been shot, or cases where somebody came into the house, the person had their gun there and shot them and prevented the crime?
We have had no burglars, no criminals shot, nor any accidental shootings, by the way, and our residential burglary rate is down dramatically. Went from 54 the year prior to the law's implementation to 9 the year following. And we've examined the other variables involved, and it's our belief that the perception that our citizens are armed was responsible for that reduction. And if that is in fact true, we have had 43 households who were not violated and did not have their possessions taken, and perhaps even personal injuries to them.
Mayor, what you say is completely at odds with what the experience of the chief has been, and that is to say that the more arming he's seen in households, it's been his experience, if I'm quoting you correctly, Chief, that the incidence of violence to the person, the innocent person, tends to increase. You're saying just the opposite. Why are you two at odds over that? Are you questioning then the veracity of his statement, perhaps?
Certainly not the chief's veracity. What I question is the fact that it's, of course, from our small town, we've had no accidents. Our people are responsible. We introduced firearm training safety programs when the law was passed. You know, the chief's premise, I think, is basically faulty in that the homicides perhaps that his people have experienced, you're assuming no homicide would have occurred had there not been a weapon, a handgun present. And I think it's difficult to make that assumption. Of course, pick up your newspaper, there are numerous articles where homicides occur in this area with an implement other than a firearm or a handgun.
Well, again, it's been the chief's experience, and I'm going to let you talk for yourself in just a minute, Chief, that it's awfully hard for a citizen, an average citizen like me or like Harv here or Bruce or your wife or my wife, to actually pull the trigger when a burglar comes in. It's much more likely that the burglar would shoot you than you shooting the burglar.
I frankly don't agree entirely with that. However, as I indicated earlier, there are many more advantages to an armed citizen other than actually shooting a perpetrator.
Like what?
Like the article that was in your local paper day before yesterday, where a burglar broke into a household. There were 2 elderly ladies there. They inquired as to his intentions. He indicated he was there to commit a sexual act. one of the ladies asked the other, told the other, said, "Hand me the gun." The burglar fled.
What about that, Chief? What about, first of all, the idea of possessing a handgun being a deterrent? How do you feel about that?
Well, I'm not familiar with the case except reading it in the newspaper, and it wasn't clear whether they in fact had a handgun or not. They may have just been a ruse of saying that they had a handgun. I don't know.
But he's saying the very idea of the criminal thinking that there's a handgun is a deterrent in itself, if I understand you correctly.
Oh, it certainly is if the criminal himself doesn't have a handgun, certainly. However, our experience is in most burglaries, if a handgun is located in the home, along with the television set and various other type of items, that handgun is more likely to be stolen than any other item in that household because it is more concealable than most of the other valuable items in a household, with the exception of jewelry or money or something like this. I have to look at what the handgun is actually used for. When I go to a homicide scene, I went, for example, to a homicide scene recently here in Charleston. We've had one homicide so far this year, and that homicide was committed with a handgun. Now, I'm sure if you asked the person who pulled the trigger, they did not have the handgun to shoot the boyfriend. That's not the purpose they bought that handgun. It was to shoot burglars or to protect the household and so forth. But in fact, when I walked up, I looked down and I said, which is the same question I've asked some 300 times in my career, is that the burglar? It has never been the burglar yet. It's old Uncle Harry, or it's my boyfriend, or my son, or whatever. Son pulls out a handgun, takes it to school, and shoots the high school coach because he put him on the second team instead of the first string of the basketball team. Things like this. I don't think that he would have confronted that coach as readily if he hadn't had a handgun. But once again, I want to point out, I make a very important distinction between having a handgun in the home for a family, for example, than I do for a person who's a single person. People are not usually getting into disputes with themselves to have a handgun, and it can be, under those circumstances, beneficial. The same thing with a businessman who owns a retail business. When they use handguns, they tend not to shoot their customers. They tend not to shoot their employees. When they use that handgun, they use it, in most cases, effectively against an armed robber or against a burglar. And that's what it's for. But in a household, a handgun is a dangerous instrument to have within the household, considering the total range of human emotions that takes place within that structure.
So you think that possession of a handgun then tends to increase domestic violence?
I certainly do so, yes, sir.
You don't agree with that, Mayor?
No, no. As a matter of fact, there have been no statistics that I've had the privilege of reading that really indicate that. There was a study done way back in '75 or '76 in the Philadelphia area that tended to indicate that. However, a close examination of those stats revealed that suicides were used and some other factors were not exactly correct. So I don't agree with that. I think weapons will be substituted in this type situation, and if you examine the record of that type person who commits this type of act, you will notice invariably an extremely violent history and criminal activity of that particular individual as a rule.
All right. Harv Jacobs.
Chief, I want to put you in a hypothetical situation. What if the city of Charleston had the same ordinance that they have in Kennesaw? How do you feel that would affect the overall crime picture? Would it rise dramatically?
I don't think it would make any difference, because I don't think that somebody is going to go out and purchase a gun simply because the law requires them to do so in any substantial number. Because I believe that just like in Kennesaw, the majority of households already have guns. And so you're not going to have a rush to the store, the gun shop, to buy a gun. Nor do I think that people would get rid of their guns if you passed a law saying they had to surrender them to the police department and, where they're going to be confiscated. I don't think that either law would be obeyed in any meaningful type of fashion. I don't see that, I think, as an effective means of reducing crime. We have, for whatever reasons, we don't necessarily take credit for it, of course, reduced burglaries, break-ins, from 1,600 here in Charleston 2 years ago down to 1,200 now a year. That is a substantial decrease, and it wasn't done with suggesting everybody get a handgun. It's done with apprehension of burglars. I think the most effective thing that we can do to stop burglary, armed robbery, rape, or any other crime is punishment by the judicial system. The apprehension of criminals is not our problem. It is the punishment of criminals, the lack of punishment of criminals in this country, that causes us to have the crime problems that we have today.
I want to ask one more question. Under the Kennesaw-type ordinance, do you feel that too many people might take the law into their own hands? In other words, all these people having handguns, they'll try to do your job, your department's job.
No, I don't believe that would be the case. I think for the reasons I've stated earlier, and that is it's a very difficult decision to use a handgun to kill somebody. Most people don't want to kill anybody. You know, we've got to really understand that. They're extremely reluctant to kill anybody. They have to be extremely angry. That is the reason why passion killings, having to do with family members doing heated arguments and so forth, as, for example, the Marvin Gaye case, which just happened. Family member here in a heated argument. This is, that gun was not purchased for by Reverend Gaye for the purpose of killing his son, I guarantee you. It was purchased for the purpose of protecting the household. But in fact what happened, as which happens in most cases, that handgun was used against a family member. And that's just a sensational case, but those cases far outnumber by the tens the number of cases that where a person has successfully used a handgun against a burglar or an armed robbery in a household setting.
Bruce Smith.
Mayor, I understand you were in Charleston to speak against a proposed handgun registration ordinance that's being proposed in Charleston. Is that correct?
I was in Charleston to speak on the gun issue in general, and of course what prompted my visit to this area was the fact that, as I understand it, the county as well as the local government is anticipating passing gun restrictive legislation.
What is your objection to registration in light of the fact that in your own town you have a rule that says everybody has to have a gun, so in effect you know where all the guns are. You know there's a gun in every household, in effect. Why are you opposed to registering guns?
I'm opposed for several reasons. One, the Supreme Court of the United States in the Haynes case has held several years ago that a criminal may not be required to register his gun, his handgun in this instance, because of his Fifth Amendment rights of self-incrimination. So what a registration law in effect does is applies to the law-abiding citizen only. Registration as such is virtually indefensible as far as I'm concerned from the proponents of it. It has no deterrent effect. Can't even make a criminal do it. It creates an extreme amount of paperwork on the police officials. It becomes expensive. It harasses your ordinary citizens.
Chief, what is your position on gun registration?
Well, gun registration, of course, as you know, is a very hot, emotional, a lot of people, and certainly a political issue with a lot of others. I look at it simply from a law enforcement professional standpoint. There are some benefits that I can think of relative to conducting certain kinds of criminal investigation, not most, but certain types of criminal investigations where registration would be of a benefit. But that benefit would be purchased at a tremendous cost in paperwork, a tremendous cost in various other kinds of human resources that could be better directed elsewhere. Knowing that a weapon is registered to a certain person certainly is not going to indicate who fired that weapon. A weapon is just being registered, the same thing as an automobile being registered. We could register handguns just like we register automobiles or changes in ownership of housing and land parcels and so forth. But you can't determine who the person was that fired that weapon. And from a law enforcement standpoint, who fired the weapon in a criminal sense or who held that weapon in a criminal sense is much more important than the fact that whether the weapon was registered or not.
Isn't there a value, though, through registration to be able to trace that weapon back to try and find out where it came from?
Oh, undoubtedly. You can trace weapons to a certain extent, assuming they followed legal channels, which many of them do not, through registration. And that, of course, would be one of the benefits from that. There are other aspects to registration, however, I think need to be looked at. That it's not registration per se, but the 3-day cooling off period. Nobody in this town, nobody in this county needs a handgun in a hurry. There's nobody that's got to have a handgun today. And people need to understand that. There's no reason why they can't wait 3 or 4 or 5 days in order to purchase a handgun to defend their house from burglars or for any other purpose that they have. People that have to have a handgun in a hurry are dangerous persons themselves.
We're going to continue here on Face the Issues, talking about handgun control and handgun registration and guns of all kinds after you watch this. We're talking here in a broad sense about the issue of gun control, I suppose, with the mayor of Kennesaw, Georgia, Mayor Darvin Purdy in Kennesaw, Georgia. Each household is required to have some kind of a gun. Also on our panel is the police chief in Charleston, Reuben Greenberg. Mayor Purdy, philosophical question to you. America is certainly one of the most civilized countries on earth, and yet we probably have one of the highest violence rates on earth. People getting shot all the time. Why do you think that is?
Well, first place, it's not true. We, from the worldwide standpoint, rank roughly in the middle. Half the nations of the world have more homicides, more violence than we do. The other half, of course, don't. We're roughly in the middle of the spectrum. Again, there are many, many facets to the reason. England is cited many times as having few deaths by guns. I suggest to you that England's homicide rate by other weapons, knives, Coke bottles, ball-peen hammers, are much less than that of the United States. We, because of many reasons, are a violent society, and again, it's very complex. The lack of the morality, I assume some of it could be attributed to the television's portrayal of violence, many reasons. So that's my thinking, that we are not, without question, the most violent country on earth.
Wouldn't, though, the availability of guns, be they handguns, whatever kind of guns, tend, as the police chief says, in a moment of violent passion, tend to increase the chances of somebody getting shot, perhaps?
Perhaps, in some isolated incidences. However, by the same token, the ready availability of something with which to defend yourself could be a distinct advantage to an innocent victim, a citizen who has been threatened and might himself be killed. So there are distinct advantages that in my view, far outweigh the benefits of trying to strip that citizen of his right to possess this weapon, which incidentally is unconditionally guaranteed by the United States Constitution.
All right, Harv Jacobs.
Mr. Mayor, what about people, your ordinance, first of all, passed 2 years ago, you said?
Yes, sir.
Were there any people who did not want to keep a gun in their house at that time?
Yes, sir. There were a few then, there are a few now, and most of them fit in with our exemptions. There were some who attempted to organize some opposition to our law. However, the vast majority of the citizens supported it, and there was no known organized opposition.
Could you take any action against anybody in your town who does not want to keep a gun?
Yes, sir. Our law has a fine up to $200 and or 60 days in jail.
But isn't that infringing on a person's right not to bear arms?
Well, governments, including this local government, has been mandating that citizens do various things since the inception of that government. Your strict zoning laws, your fire detection devices in the homes, your zoning codes. It's not uncommon for a government to mandate something for safety purposes.
Chief, I'd like your thoughts on that. The right not to bear arms, to throw somebody in jail for not keeping a gun in the house, what do you think of that?
Well, as the mayor said, that governments have various kinds of police powers having to do with health, zoning, and so forth. And in theory, I suppose you could require them to have, hook their sewer lines up to the street or whatever, rather than having an outhouse. And you could do the same thing relative to possibly to the ownership of a handgun. But the point that I would like to make is that, aside from the fact that I read somewhere, I don't want to quote it because I don't know exactly where I read it, that I thought that crime had actually gone up in Kennesaw during the interim period of having this law in the books where people were required to have a firearm, and not that it had gone down. I believe I read that in the Atlanta Constitution, but I did read it someplace. But in any case, I want to point out that I'm not in favor of any law, no matter what that law is, where there is no means of enforcing it, and especially when there is no intent to enforce it. I don't believe you could convict somebody in this country for failing to have a handgun or a rifle, for that matter, in his house. And the same thing, I don't think you could convict anybody in this country, given its history, for a person having a handgun or a rifle in their home just because they have one. If that person was a convicted felon or something, or perhaps a mental patient, I could understand that. But I simply don't think that the people who, after all, we're responsible to as a police department or a local government would countenance either situation.
Let's go now to Bruce Smith.
Mayor, you were quoted in one of the news articles as saying that you don't believe that police owe individuals protection, but they owe society protection. And I was just curious if you could sort of expand on that and explain exactly what you mean by that.
Sure, I'll be glad to. I didn't say that's not an exact quote. What it is I said that police do not owe individuals protection. They owe society as a whole protection. And where this came from was Washington, D.C. There were some people breaking into a residence up there. The two ladies involved, one of them called the police. The police came out and knocked on the door, heard no disturbance, and left. As a consequence, the burglars or crime perpetrators later gained entrance to the dwelling and killed one of the two ladies involved. A suit was brought against the police department for failing to protect them individually, and the federal court involved held that the police owe protection to society in general and not to individual citizens. Police cannot be at all places at all times. It's up to the individual to, in some instances, to take care of his own self as well as to protect his own family.
A quick question, Bruce. That's all the time we have then. Thank you very much, Mayor Darvin Purdy of Kennesaw, Georgia, for being on our program. Thank you, Police Chief Reuben Greenberg, and thank you, too, for joining us on Face the Issues.